Well, good morning, y'all. I am super grateful and excited to be with you today. And hopeful that we could, walk away with a renewed sense and understanding of what moral injury is, as well as this term that I have become kind of attracted to, which is heart work. I know many of us show up from various disciplines and we all engage in this behavioral healthcare workforce, but I really believe that we are a group of folks who, undoubtedly have to use our heart to do this work. And so a softer and kinder way, instead of saying like, I'm in the behavioral healthcare workforce, is like, I'm engaged in heart work, because you got to use your heart in every single way to do this work, which also makes us a bit more susceptible to moral injury, which I'll certainly move through today. What I definitely want to share as a disclaimer, y'all, your rage is welcomed right here. I think many times, many of us find ourselves being shamed for rage that we have from the work that we engage in with harmful systems, right? That many of us are a part of, we have contributed to, and we want to see change, but sometimes we feel hopeless and helpless. So I just want you to know that your rage is welcomed here in our conversations in the chat, and also in the questions that you ask. It has a place with us this morning. And here's what I'm hoping that we can accomplish while we have each other today, which is differentiate between burnout, compassion fatigue, and moral injury, because many times we like to jumble, especially burnout and compassion fatigue together when they're very different things. They have some similarities, but they're very different things. The second one is to draw some parallels between burnout, compassion fatigue, moral injury, and organizational trauma. I was kind of looking at the chat box and I saw people were hoping to learn how moral injury impacts the populations that we work with, when I really want us to focus on how it impacts us as heart workers, as practitioners, right? Like, we are feeling the brunt of it. And of course, we transmit that down to the populations that we serve, but we also receive it from the systems and organizations that we're a part of. So I really wanted to take a look at drawing parallels between all of those things. And the last one, encourage people to research and share the relationship between moral injury and heart work. That has been a part of my mission for this last, I would say, probably 14 months. That I have been able to share this information with folks across the country, is just how are we encouraging and contributing to the research around moral injury in our particular fields that we're a part of. And so we're gonna do a little technology check. I'm gonna invite your participation using Slido. So you can go to your phone, your computer, your tablet, whatever you have. You're gonna enter into the web browser, slido.com. You will then be prompted to provide that 6-digit code that you see on the side panel. And we're going to do a little technology check and give folks a chance to log into the system real quick and respond to the question. Sing the song if you got to sing it though, right? Like, if somebody puts their hand up on your hip, what's the most appropriate response, y'all? What you supposed to do if somebody put their hand up on your hip? Sing the song if you got to sing the song. Make sure everybody's here with the technology. Cool, cool. Looks like the responses are coming in. People are getting access to Slido. Beautiful, beautiful. So we know it works. All of the above is the answer, y'all. Y'all know how the song goes. You put your hand up on my hip. I dip, you dip, we dip. You got to do them all. You can't just do one without the other. All right, cool. The next question that I want to throw out there, just to get a sense of who is in this space with us today, is how long have you been engaged in heart work, right? Are you kind of new to the game? Are you an OG? Like, you done been in it for decades on decades? You kind of consider what I call myself to be a young OG. I've been engaged in the work for the last 10 years, primarily working with youth and young adults with cross systems involvement. And my work before I moved upstream in 2019 was working with court impacted youth in the city of Richmond. So I kind of consider myself to be a young OG. It looks like we got a nice little mix. We have a whole bunch of OGs in here today, as well as, some young OGs like myself. Kurt, it is quite okay if you can't access, or anyone else, if you can't access Slido, you can certainly participate using the chat box. Cool, so I'm gonna move us along to the next question I have. Just take a moment, and I just want us to reconnect. And if you can't get access to Slido, please go ahead and put it in the chat. But what was your first meaningful job? internship or a volunteer experience? Like, what was that thing where you were like, wow, I'm connected to this. I like the way this work feels. Like, this feels right on me. This feels good to me. Got a wide range to see some detention work, CASA, working in shelters, counselors, see other folks volunteering in an ID center, coming in through the chat box, working in a group home for teens. Like, I did that for 6 years. Some of the best work of my life, working in nursing homes, see some intensive in-home, CPS, wonderful, working in refugee resettlement. So a wide range, right, of like that job or experience that kind of connected us to where we are and set us down this trajectory. And I'm asking us to reflect on that for a moment, because many times when we get deep in the work, especially if you're an OG, like you've been in it a decade on top of decade, we can kind of forget and disconnect from the thing that brought us here, because then we start to bear witness to so many things that ultimately end up breaking our heart. And so we're going to talk a little bit about burnout and compassion fatigue. And what I will share before we get into this area is, for me, 2018 was the absolute worst year of my career. In 2018, I had 3 young people die that I was working with. 2 were murdered and 1 was fatally struck by a car when leaving work. And when I think about that time in my career and the things that I was going through, I had people at work, leadership, the organization just saying it was burnout, right? Like, oh, you're just burnt out, you're just experiencing X, Y, and Z. But I knew deep down it was something way greater than burnout that I was experiencing, especially when I think about one of those young people. And like we did everything, right? We say this as folks engaged in the work, we did everything to help, meaning he should not have died, right? Because we did everything. But then when you start pulling the layers back and you see where the system failed way before that young person was ever in my life or where I started working with them. And then you start to build on top of these things, where I began to recognize that it wasn't burnout that I was actually experiencing, or necessarily compassion fatigue. But what I want to do is take some time to differentiate and define these 2 things. And so let's start with burnout, y'all. And using the chat box, just kind of respond this way. I want us to think like, if burnout, if it had a smell, what would it smell like? And just kind of let us know in the chat, like, if burnout had a smell, what would it smell like? Burnt popcorn, sour milk, burnt rubber, yeah, bitter, just like ashes. If burnout tastes like something, what burnout tastes like? If it had a taste. Sour. Yeah, what about a textured feeling? Not an emotional feeling, but a texture. If burnout had a textured feeling, what would that feel like? Sandy, thorny, right? Gritty. I'm gonna tell y'all right now, at this point, nobody has used any word that feels good, tastes good, smells good, sounds good, right? So we know that burnout is not something we associate with a pleasant feeling. And so here's how burnout is kind of formally defined. Burnout is a state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion caused by excessive and prolonged stress. It occurs when you feel overwhelmed, emotionally drained, and unable to meet constant demands. As the stress continues, you begin to lose the interest and motivation that led you to take on a certain role in the first place. What I want us to pay attention to is that excessive and prolonged stress part, right? And so it's just repeatedly being exposed to these things that are incredibly stressful. Now, compassion fatigue, which a lot of us know as secondary traumatic stress, and we hear this, I think, a bit more often than we probably have in the past, is that compassion fatigue is also known as secondary traumatic stress, and it's a condition characterized by gradual lessening of compassion over time, right? So we just slowly start to lose the compassion we have for others and ultimately for ourselves as we're kind of exposed to these various things. And we know that there are occupations that are at greater risk of this. Some of the ones that are at greater risk of compassion fatigue are behavioral health care heart workers, right? Like just at greater risk of compassion fatigue, given the nature of the work. Now, burnout and compassion fatigue are different things, but they have some similarities, and here's how they look, is that the emotional exhaustion, right? Reduced sense of personal accomplishment or meaning in the work. A mental exhaustion, decreased interactions with others, so begin to isolate, right? A depersonalization, so our symptoms disconnect from real causes. Physical exhaustion, you feel the stuff in your body, right? So it truly takes an entire toll on a whole person. And so here are what some of the symptoms of compassion fatigue look like. And I'm just going to throw them up here, and I want y'all to take a look and reflect on them. So it can look like feeling the burdens or sufferings of other people, isolating yourself, bottling up emotions, right? Denial, excessive use of drugs and alcohol, poor self-care, overeating, all of these things, right, can be symptoms of compassion fatigue. Now, the question that I'm going to ask, which is on this screen, and it says, like, what symptoms of compassion fatigue have you experienced or witnessed in other people? I want y'all to respond to that using the chat box, but I'm going to go back so you can see the list. So the question that's out there for us to kind of chat and reflect on is, what are some of the symptoms of compassion fatigue you have experienced yourself or you have witnessed in other people? So I see the impatience pop up, lack of pleasure, poor self-care, that burden, right? Those things. Yeah, these things are real, right? And I know there are times when we see them in other people before we're probably able to see them in ourselves. We might see them in colleagues, we might see them in leadership, right? Like we see these symptoms show up all around us in the work that we do. So here's what I want us to take away as being the clear difference, right? Is that compassion fatigue has a more rapid onset, while burnout emerges over time. Compassion fatigue has a faster recovery. It's less severe if we can recognize and manage it early. I want us to think like compassion fatigue are the symptoms, right? You see these things, you see the various behaviors that many of you are starting, continuing to list in the chat box. And if we don't address them, if we don't acknowledge them, then when they start to compound, then yeah, it can turn into something like burnout. But what I see frequently is we like to start with burnout. Like I've had the privilege of working with, new social workers or those who are just entering into the field or those who are in school who are telling me they burnt out. And this might be the case, it might be true, but I understand burnout being the end. For me, burnout is when like I give all this up and I go work at the bank or something and underwrite loans, right? But what I have done, I've never left this work. Now I have left me some jobs, right? I'm a full-blown millennial. I'll quit your job and go to another one real quick. So I have left some jobs, but I have never left the work. And so the way I understand burnout is the complete detachment and walking away from the work and from the field. And that compassion fatigue is certainly the symptoms, right, that we just took a look at and many folks identified with. But I also acknowledge there's this other thing that's floating around burnout and floating around compassion fatigue that I believe to be moral injury, which we'll talk about in a couple moments. So organizational trauma is the next stop that we're going to take. And for me, when I was able to kind of get a greater understanding of what this is and how it showed up in the various agencies and organizations that I have worked throughout my career, I've worked in schools, hospitals, I've worked in residential treatment, I've worked in the juvenile legal system, right? Congregate care, all of these things, all these various systems, all these various organizations and agencies and departments. And so I had to recognize after leaving that work that those organizations were very, very traumatized and everything really wasn't mine to own. And so organizational trauma is defined or looked at as this, is that trauma can affect organizations just as it affects individuals, families, and communities. And just as silence and lack of understanding about trauma hurts individuals, so too does it hurt organizations. And one thing that happens for sure is this parallel transmission of trauma. And if we just kind of look at it, right, as the staff or as the heart worker sitting in the middle of this particular diagram, right, in our work and our role, we could be feeling unsafe, angry, aggressive, helpless, hopeless, depressed, overwhelmed, and demoralized. But we also are working alongside client populations that could very much so feel unsafe, angry, aggressive, helpless, hopeless, depressed, and overwhelmed. While we're also inside of an organization and our client populations are receiving services from an organization that is unsafe, that is punitive, that is stuck, that is missionless, crisis-driven, overwhelmed, and directionless. So at the end of the day, we really just end up transmitting trauma up and down, right? Organizations are traumatizing staff, staff carrying their own trauma and passing that on down to clients, right? And so we really never get to break away from this because we also are working inside of organizations who don't want to acknowledge that they are also traumatized and then transmitting that to staff and then not acknowledging staff's trauma, who are then transmitting that to clients. And then we wonder why things aren't getting better, right? And then we sit back and wonder why clients don't show up for appointments. And then we blame them for things that are out of their control. Because then we have productivity hours that we need to meet because organizations say we have to have a certain amount of contact hours for our jobs to be justified. And then we sit back and wonder why things aren't getting better and people are quitting. So we know that there are higher risk of organizational trauma is inside of heart work because of this ongoing wounding from racism, sexism, oppression. All of this stuff is inside of orgs. It doesn't matter the equity statement that an organization makes or these equity committees that organizations love to create now. These things are still embedded inside the structures and systems of agencies, departments, and organizations, which can then create this hostile relationship with the community and the workforce, right? There's also this idea behind this redemptive nature of the work. We're incredibly hopeful people, heart workers. We believe that change is possible, that things can get better, that people deserve the best and more. And so we try to embody that in the work that we do. Incredibly empathic nature of this work. There's no way to do it without opening up your heart. And there's a lot of risk associated in that. And so we know that organizations that are at higher risk of experiencing trauma are those that are engaged in the work that all of you do. But then we don't want to acknowledge that the trauma exists. And some of the symptoms of organizational trauma look like this. Closed boundaries, stress and anxiety, right? Organizational amnesia. Sometimes the org, agency, or department forgets what it's supposed to be doing in the first place and tries to then start doing everything but what they were designed to do, their role and function. Unrecognizing wounding from trauma, doesn't want to recognize it at all. An unproductive relationship between the organization and environment. Sometimes you end up with orgs, agencies, and departments that don't even like the client population that they are there to serve. And we can't hide from that. Limiting attitudes and worldviews, just this loss in a sense of hope, this apathy that organizations can then start to kind of, transfer on to the populations that they serve and blame them for their conditions. Depression, despair, and this loss of hope that things just aren't going to get better. However, we're measuring better inside of the work that we do. And then I want to draw out 3 of these symptoms of organizational trauma, one being closed boundaries, because I see this a lot. is that it's similar to individual survival strategies. Organizations that are traumatized, are frightened, and often close their boundaries, don't want to collaborate, right? Don't want to work with other organizations, other communities. And then you also see it inside of organizations. Different units don't want to work with other units. They close their boundaries inside their own org, right? So it kind of creates this us and them mentality. And I know I'm not the only one that has bear witness to this, right? I hear it frequently in this work, right? Is that this us and them, well, they can't do it how we do it, so we're just going to do it all ourselves. Well, that's not how this work is supposed to be done, right? And then, as it says in this last part, is that this can happen between organizations and the community, or between groups within the agency. I know y'all see that. You won't be able to convince me that you don't see this happen within your own organizations. The second one that I want to pay a little bit closer attention to is this limited attitude and worldviews. And so it looks like our attitudes in police, they influence how we see the world and how we interact with it. And when a traumatized organization believes, for example, that nobody in the community can be trusted, they stop collaborating with community partners, or perhaps speaking with them altogether. But then we love to tote collaboration, right? When we put out our monthly newsletters or our annual reports, and we throw up partner logos on a website. We love to tote collaboration. But then at the core of that, you have organizations who are incredibly distrusting of each other. And that trickles down into staff. And if you think the client populations that we're not there to serve don't feel that, you're mistaken. So if we believe that our work is hopeless and things will not improve, we might lose energy for completing projects or having trouble retaining staff. I know for a fact there is high turnover in behavioral health. And that's not just because it's been on the news the last several months, but because I've been in it for over a decade. I've witnessed it. I've seen it. Incredibly high turnover. And it's not necessarily the people showing up to do the work. It's these organizations and these systems not caring about the people who are showing up to engage in the work. And then these limited attitudes and worldviews can lead to erosion of identity, where we forget who we are as an organization and lose faith in the abilities to do what we're there to do. And the last one that I want to draw close attention to is depression, despair, and this loss of hope. The same way an individual heart worker or practitioner can experience these things, so can an organization. And this is when an organization becomes depressed, there is a real danger of an organization failing. Depression can manifest as rapid turnover of staff, board members, missing grant deadlines, not following through on reporting, right? All of these things, like organizations show behaviors of depression the same way individual shows the behaviors of depression. But we don't really make room to acknowledge the different behaviors that an organization might have when they really are dealing with trauma, depression, despair, and a loss of hope. Yeah, I see someone dropped in the chat box, the CEO quitting. Yeah. But what I also want to acknowledge that organizational trauma does not exist absent of other traumas. And that's this idea that each of us as individuals, we come in, we contribute to an organization or agency's culture, but we also carry our own stuff, right? So I know for me, existing as a Black woman, I have my experiences with race-based trauma. So racial trauma is something that I carry, that I was born into, right? And it follows me inside of organizations or agencies that I have worked for. So I'm dealing with that trauma, as well as personal trauma, and then being impacted by organizational trauma. And then I'm using every part of my heart to do this work, to make things better for the client population that I'm committed to. And then kids keep dying, right? Like that was my story back in 2018. The kids kept dying. And that wasn't burnout. Far from it. And so now we're going to talk a little bit about moral injury. But before we get there, we're going to take us a baby break. I love a good baby break and a pause, right? Because I know that's a lot of information. And sometimes we got to look at a cute face, take a deep breath, and get ready for a next stage in our conversation, which is going to be about moral injury. So I'm going to show a video. It's by Dr. Z. And for those who want to access the video on your own after our time together, you can just go to YouTube and put in like Dr. Z moral injury and it will come up. So this video was shown to me in 2018 by one of my colleagues. And when I tell you, it gave me language for what I was feeling. And it really pointed me down this path that I've currently been on since then. And so he's a medical doctor, Dr. Z. And so he's going to use an analogy that he's going to explain moral injury through the lens of the healthcare system. But I believe that what he does share is applicable to the work that we all do. And so I want you to be able to listen to it through your own lens of your work. And then we'll just kind of take a moment to be with the video after it's done. And if folks, you could just let me know in the chat box. You shouldn't have an issue with the audio, but just kind of, let me know in the chat box if we can hear and everything's good.
What's up, everybody? It's Dr. Z. Okay, listen, I'm really, really, really tired of people calling it burnout. What over 50% of healthcare professionals are experiencing, they call it burnout. It's exhaustion, low productivity, and a feeling of deep cynicism. And it's so prevalent that everyone even in administration is starting to panic. Like, what's going on? Why are physicians and nurses and PAs, why are they burning out? Well, burnout is a kind of victim shaming. It's saying you're not resourceful enough, you're not resilient enough, you're not strong enough to adapt to a system. So maybe you should meditate. Maybe you should use some lavender essential oil. Maybe we could have a wellness retreat or hire a chief wellness officer. Listen, it's all bullshit. Here's what's really going on. We're not suffering from burnout. We're suffering from something that Wendy Dean and Simon Talbot call moral injury. Let that sink in for a second. People go to war. They have a set of moral values. They care about other human beings. And then they're forced to either become a part of or bear witness to things that are so against everything they believe that when they come back, they fall apart. We call it PTSD. We have a million different names for it. What it is moral injury. Humans are moral, idealistic creatures that resonate love for other humans. And what happens when our moral ideals meet the real world, where we cannot give our patients the care we know that we could give if we had the tools and the resources and the autonomy to do it? What happens when we're trained in our schooling to give the best possible care to patients, regardless of their socioeconomic status, regardless of their race, regardless of their condition or their gender? But then we meet the real world, where it's all about the insurance company's bottom line. It's all about the hospital system's revenue. It's all about throughput and RVUs. And then we meet an electronic health record that is a glorified cash register with a little patient stuff tacked on. And we stare at that instead of staring at the vulnerable person who's having the worst day of their lives, and you can't be with them. How would that make anybody feel, let alone some of the most resourceful, resilient, passionate human beings on the planet are healthcare professionals? These are people who went into this field with an almost evangelical religious zeal to help others. Why do I say that? Because they sacrificed their 20s. They sacrificed financial stability early on. They sacrificed family. They sacrificed sleep. They sacrificed their own health because they felt they were going to be part of something much larger than them. That is the highest aspiration of any human being. And they had a moral code to go with that. Then they meet our healthcare system. And all it is the opposite of what their morality tells them they need to do for patients. So what's going to happen? What's going to happen to a good person in a bad system when they feel they can't change the system, but they have to adapt? They're going to adapt, they're going to adapt, they're going to adapt, and then they're going to break. And that's what they call burnout. It's not burnout. The next administrator who tells you they're trying to manage burnout, tell them to go fuck themselves. Tell them it's moral injury. And until we know what it is, we're never going to be able to treat it. How are you going to treat moral injury? You change the system that is causing the moral injury. You change the electronic health record to make it about bringing us closer to our patients, about making eye contact, about taking busy work off our plate. You change the conflict that drives us. Any given doctor on any given day serves three masters, at least: the patient, themselves and their family and their own financial interests, and their employer. And all three of those may be at odds. So how do you fix moral injury? You bring them in sync. We should be able to do well financially and well with our families and have time with our families while doing good for our patients. We call that Health 3.0, and it's where healthcare has to go. It means we need technology that enables the human relationship, that allows us to take care of the unique human story at hand. We need the tools, resources, and autonomy to do our jobs, because guess what? Administrators don't know how to take care of patients. That's why we exist. Why do you think they call healthcare workers that are actually touching patients frontline healthcare workers? Where does that come from? The front lines of war. We use the language of war when we're taking care of patients, and we suffer the wounds of war, the moral injury, the PTSD of not being able to live up to our ideals. So the call to action is this: we on the front lines need to stand up to our leaders and demand that they lead, that they recognize that moral injury is something that needs to be taken into account, and we need to design systems and human systems that actually address that fundamental conflict. Stop putting Band-Aids on burnout and victim shaming suffering clinicians who are committing suicide at alarming rates. If you think this is a victimless problem and doctors and nurses are just entitled, privileged whiners, you can shut the up, because people are dying. Good people, friends of mine, friends of yours have died from moral injury. It is not us. It is this system, and it's time we fixed it. The call to action is this: share this video. We need everyone in leadership, in government, in industry, and on the front lines to see this video. And let's stop calling it burnout. From here on out, we out.
All right. We're just going to take a moment. Right. And if folks want to, I saw folks sharing as the video was playing, but if anything has come up for you after watching that, you want to take this moment, either share in the chat box or just take some deep breaths and reflect on your own. I invite you to do that now.
What's up?
So what is moral injury? Moral injury is a term that was developed and comes out of Veterans Affairs. And so what people saw when they were working with folks returning from combat is they were coming back different, of course, but it wasn't PTSD. It was something greater, something deeper than just symptoms of PTSD. And so these concepts and ideas around moral injury were birthed about like 30 years ago. But we've seen an emergence in research that shows that moral injury shows up in hard work, right? Professions like social workers, police officers, counselors, whatever that is, right? Like we've seen an increase in research showing that there's a connection between those professions and moral injury as well. And it's not just folks who are going off to war. And this is how moral injury is kind of defined or understood. Is moral injury is the damage done to one's conscious or moral compass when that person perpetuates, witnesses, or fails to prevent acts that transgress one's own moral beliefs, values, or ethical code of conduct. So, right, that's perpetuate, witness, or fail to prevent. I know for a fact that I have done all three. Early in my career, I definitely perpetuated. I've certainly witnessed it. And there are many times when I failed to prevent acts that transgress my own moral beliefs, values, and my ethical code of conduct. And then what we find over time is that violating your ethical code, it can and it will damage your mental health. When we're constantly asked to do things, when we constantly see things, right? And we constantly engage in things that don't feel good to us, but we do it. It's our job and we do it. That damages your mental health. But rarely is there room to acknowledge that, especially if we're working inside of organizations that are traumatized and then are traumatizing the workforce. But violating your ethical code of conduct, it can damage your mental health. And so we'll come back to this question, but I want to share some examples. The question that's out there is, what are some morally disrupting aspects of heart work? And before I'll share examples, one that I can't shake, and it has been over a decade. I used to work in a residential treatment facility for adolescents. And there was a practice that we had that when a young person was moving facilities and going to another one, when they would go away for school that day, as unit staff, we would be told to go into their room and pack all of their stuff in trash bags, put it in the back of the van, call them down from school, and then transfer them to their next placement. And that has been over a decade when I used to do that. And I still can't shake that, right? That is something that I perpetuated and I engaged in. But that's like one example that I have held on to this long, but didn't know what it was until 10 years later, that is something that was morally disrupting. And there are countless incidents I know that I have, and I imagine many of you have as well, but here are some examples. It's terminating or scaling back of services. Lies that are told to our clients by agency staff and colleagues, right? Witnessing unethical agency practices, like the example that I've provided, but I've done this training before with folks with DJJ, so, juvenile justice, and one of the probation officers shared that her supervisor asked her to call in one of her clients, one of her young people, for an office visit, only to have ICE be called and detain them in the office. Right? And so witnessing those unethical agency practices. Another example is forcing workers to follow through on questionable policies and practices. How often does this happen? Pain in believing that one's actions or inactions have caused harm. I know I still sit with this one today. Definitely the work that I engaged in when I worked with justice-involved youth. And then being involved in cases of extreme maltreatment. So these are just some examples, and I know that you all likely have your own. And so what are the consequences of moral injury? Moral injury can lead to serious distress, depression, and suicidality, just like he mentioned in the video. Moral injury can take the life of those suffering from it, both in the metaphorical and literal sense. Moral injury debilitates people, preventing them from living full and healthy lives. And the effects of moral injury, it goes beyond the individual and can destroy one's capacity to trust others, right? Impinging on our family systems and larger communities, moral injury must be brought forward into the community for a shared process of healing. Got to talk about it, got to acknowledge it. Here's a quote that kind of summarizes how moral injury is certainly something that has to do with the metaphysical. So it's things that we feel in our body, not just physically, but emotionally and even spiritually, however you identify what that looks like for you. But this quote says that moral injury is a broken spirit. It's not a disorder or a psychiatric condition, though it profoundly affects our mental health. It is a loss of our capacity for trust and empathy, for a sense of meaning, or even our faith. I know for a fact that in 2018, not only was my spirit broken, but my heart was broken. I had a lot of beliefs and dreams about what it meant to be a social worker. And in 2018, I had to mourn that none of that stuff was true. And so I've been able throughout my healing process, from when my heart was broken, when my spirit was broken, to really understand what it means for me to do this work and how to also detach from expectations, right? I have come to acknowledge that there are many things that are going to outlive me because they existed before I started to do this work and existed before I was even alive. Racism, poverty, suffering, violence, all of these things are going to outlive me. And no matter what I do individually, I will not be able to end any of that. I can't stop kids from being shot, right? I can't end any of that. But I can still do good work, right? I can still find a way to engage in this work with my whole heart, with an understanding and acceptance that I won't be able to end the suffering. And so that really talks about, like, what is the so now what? What do we do with all of that? How do we even acknowledge what's going on? Y'all, we got to say it. We can't keep calling something burnout when it's not. We got to start speaking the truth. We have to be able to acknowledge that many of us are good people working inside of bad systems. We also have to acknowledge that these systems aren't broken. These systems are working exactly how they're supposed to work. But we also have to have the radical imagination that we can create new systems that are more human, more compassionate. But we can't do that without acknowledging that we, as folks engaged in hard work, we're suffering too. And it's not just burnout, and we can't sniff lavender or do yoga or go blow bubbles in the corner in the wellness cubicle. When I used to work at DSS, they had a wellness cubicle with bubbles. We can't just go blow bubbles in the corner and things get better. We also have to be able to engage in everyday courage in whatever quadrant kind of resonates with you, right? If that's that moral courage, the disciplined courage, intellectual courage, empathic courage. We have to be able to put all of these things together and use them so that we can have, right? And believe in the radical imagination that we can create new systems with the work that we do. Also, soul repair. This is something that researchers in moral injury kind of tote as the thing to correct or respond to feelings of moral injury. And Dr. Rita Brock is one of the pioneers in this research. And she talks about soul repair, which talks about, like, how do we rebuild our empathy? Because remember, moral injury is this loss of trust, broken spirit, broken heart. So we have to be able to rebuild our empathy and consciousness and connection to all things that are good, right? A deep connection, like I said, with all things that are good and true. And also a restoration of trust, love, gratitude, play, compassion, and peace. How do we gain these things again? How do we make them stronger in our own lives and in the work that we do? So I'm gonna leave y'all with this quote from Dr. Rita Brock, and it says, a whole person goes off to war. And y'all gotta remember, like, the work that we do as hard workers and behavioral healthcare practitioners, we're at war. If that is social justice, racial justice, environmental, economic, whatever it is that you fight for in the work that you do with the client populations that you serve, you are at war. Which means your body, mind, and psyche and spirit all are a part of you. And the person who left for war will never be the same or forget what happens. It is not possible for us to get up and do this work every single day and not change and not forget the things that we witness, the things that we do, the things that we don't do, and it not affect us. So we gotta recognize that we're whole people in this work, and this work changes us, but we have to pay close attention to how those changes show up and really work on stopping the transmission of trauma onto the client populations that we serve, and also preventing our organizations from increasing our trauma that we experience. So leave you with one more smiling baby, because that one is cute. You ain't gonna lie about that. And then I read some things and redid some research. This is my contact information for anyone that is interested with connecting with me. And then we can open it up for any Q&A.
Thank you so much, Kim. That was fantastic. And yes, please use the Q&A function on the bottom of the Zoom chat if you all have any questions. Additionally, I am putting into the chat the link for the evaluation, the link for the request for certificate of participation, and a link if you would like to join my listserv to hear about other training opportunities coming up. Actually, there is a good question here. The first one here on any tips on making leadership see this. And before I toss this over to Kim, I will say that we are doing a version of this training for DBHDS's leadership. So I don't know, how that will trickle down to the other agencies. But Kim, if you want to follow up on that, please do so.
I mean, I think you did a great job. I'm excited for the opportunity to engage with leadership. And y'all, I will say every time that I have done this training for direct service hard workers, they're like, yo, my supervisor needs to hear this, or the people making decisions with the power need to hear this. And so I agree with y'all 100%. And I did see the request for my contact information again in the chat. So I'm getting ready to drop that for y'all.
All right, if anybody has any other questions, please put them into the Q&A, or if you want to share some feedback that you would like to be read out. Okay, so when will the DBHDS training be done so I can point supervisor to attend? Well, the DBHDS training will be done later this month. I'm not sure if it will be sort of like an open invitation to all supervisors. We do have a sort of limited number of participants available, so I can't say whether or not your specific supervisor will be attending, but as I said, this video here has been recorded. So if you feel compelled and you would like to share this video with them, please do so. That might be one way of addressing that. All right. Next here is, how do you suggest combating the organizational trauma, especially when they are not willing to even acknowledge it?
Yeah. I would say preserve yourself, right? We already know, like even in the work that we do, if it's at the individual level, working with clients, there has to be a level of awareness. And so we can do our part to bring the information to bolster the awareness, but we can't always move folks from awareness to action. And if we do, we can't do that at the sacrifice of ourselves. And so I think you can do whatever you can for the awareness piece, and see if action is even in, a thought in your organization's mind. But then don't sacrifice yourself. Don't sacrifice your peace. Don't sacrifice your sanity, trying to get an organization to move from awareness to action, because they will ultimately move on without you as a whole person if you find yourself not even being able to function in your role.
Thank you for sharing that, Kim. I have a follow-up question here from someone who is like the concept of the courage quadrants. They wanted to know about the source for that so they can do some more reading.
Yeah, let me see. I think it is a general graphic under there's concepts around everyday courage, and it is one of the general graphics. So you can probably go to Google image search and put everyday courage, or even Google Scholars, and you'll see the article associated with the graphic.
Awesome, thank you. And just some of these kind of more process questions here in the Q&A. I will be following up with the people who registered for this webinar with the recording. I will send you a direct link to it. It may take up to a week to receive, just to let you know. And yeah, I'm happy to share that with you. All right, I have one last bigger question here for you, Kim, in the question and answer section. And this is a person who said they recently had a friend leave a job because something within the organization did not sit well with them. They were wondering if there's a concept around retaining our moral values through acts like this and leaving when called to.
Listen, I quit my job without having a job in 2019. So, you know, I understand. I understand what that is and what that feels like, and how it's also not easy to do, but it was so necessary. I would say I was the most stressed up until the point when I decided to leave my job, and a sense of calmness came over me. And when that calmness came, the clarity came, and I was like, I got to leave this or else I'm about to lose myself. So I get it. It is not ideal. It's not what we probably want to do. There are many of us who likely need to quit our jobs. And we understand other things keep us connected, if that's mortgage, right? Responsibilities, health insurance. But I understand, I certainly deeply connect with walking away from something that is compromising who you are, and it's snatching your peace and your joy. And none of us should be called to do that.
Thank you, Kim. I'm not seeing any last questions populate in here, so I'll give you all about 30 more seconds. And if that doesn't happen, we'll end the webinar shortly. And as a reminder, I am putting the link for the evaluation, the request for a certificate, and if you want to join the listserv to have future trainings to get access to those, you can sign up for the listserv. Upcoming, we have in the next month in September, it is September 1st. In the next month, we have 2 trainings, one coming up with a social justice lens on crisis response with some particular eye on Marcus Alert with Dr. Sarah Vinson. And then we just confirmed one with somebody who's going to talk about work with navigating refugees through the behavioral healthcare system. And she is an Afghan woman herself, so will give us some insight on the Afghan refugee population coming in to Virginia and other places across the US. All right, thank you all so much. Thank you so much, Kim. I will be following up with all the slides, the recording, the evaluation, etc. So thank you so much. And Kim, if you have any final words you want to part with.
Oh yeah, well, look, y'all, thank you so much for having me. Something I always just like to share is at the end of the day, we have to be able to take care of our hearts so that we can take care of each other, because we're literally all we have. All we have is each other. So that means we got to take care of us so we can take care of each other.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.